thank you everyone for coming. So we have 3 panel presentations. First, Professor Heather Dubois will present. Heather Dubois is an assistant professor of peace studies, trauma, and spirituality at Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. She is writing Moving from Impasse, a book that uses the spirituality of John of the Cross and the critical theory of Judith Butler to theorize transformation at the nexus of self and society. She teaches classes on suffering, social justice, gender, conflict transformation, social spiritual care, and trauma healing. After graduating with her doctorate from the University of Notre Dame, she worked at Florida State University and Soho College. Before joining the academy, she worked in the NGO sector. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you. It's very good to be here with you all. To prepare my remarks for today, I looked very closely at the title of the symposium or colloquium and the title of the panel. And so I don't have for you a narrative or a set of stories or an argument. It's more like a word association, an extended reflection on the titles. So to recall for us, the title of this panel is Descolonial Rituals, Performativity, and Resistances. And am I holding the mic at the appropriate space for my mouth? Are we good? Okay. All right, here we go. To be fully alive. The glory of God is the human being fully alive. That is a quotation from Irenaeus, a 2nd century bishop and saint. To be fully alive, to flourish, to fulfill potential as a living creature. Once I used this phrase in a title, I submitted the piece of writing, and then a few days later, I asked to change. I wanted the title to read instead, to be more fully alive. Being a good critic of modernity, I am wary of grand narratives of fulfillment. I thought that the unadorned, fully alive was claiming too much. There seemed to be too much divinization and not enough humanization in the phrase. It seemed too aspirational. I was trying to make a point about the realities of suffering and injustice. While so many people struggle to survive because of our structures and cultures, should we not qualify references to flourishing? Should we not be more modest in our scholarly claims? To feel fully alive. This time it's a quotation from Bessel van der Kolk, who is a contemporary psychiatrist and something of a trauma healing rock star. In his book, The Body Keeps Score, van der Kolk wrote about the changes that occur, quote, in the brain area that communicates the physical embodied feeling of being alive, unquote. This area of the brain is altered for worse in the wake of trauma, and it can be altered again for better through therapeutic and creative experiences. The feeling of being alive can be addressed in literal terms. Van der Kolk's neurological discussion of aliveness put into perspective my hesitant adoption of the words of Irenaeus, and it helped me understand why the phrase has always resonated with me so much. We want to be fully alive because we do not want to live half-lives and worse. To be fully alive, to experience our vitality, more to revel in it, to make merry with it, to celebrate it with exuberance. It is noteworthy that in some contexts, to revel in one's vitality has the power of rebellion. These words, revel and rebellion, are in fact linked etymologically. To be fully alive is to experience our vitality holistically, as bodies, in spirit, in our ways of knowing and being, as finite relational creatures who can receive and give life. In the context of coloniality, to be fully alive involves experiencing reality. Reality instead of lies about who people are and what has happened. To be fully alive involves experiencing agency instead of domination. of bodies, spirits, and ways of being and knowing. Lies and domination create the illusion of coherent, impenetrable hegemony. Performativity, there's a key word from our panel title. The theory of performativity helps us to reveal that this hegemony is an illusion. It is an illusion, where colonial theories of anthropology, culture, and religion encourage us to perceive coherent substance. Performativity points to dynamic activity. Theories of substance are not completely false. Uninterrupted activity over time does give the appearance and even the experience of substance. It can truly seem like lies and domination are just the world. It is what it is. But this substantive vision of life perceives too little of what is happening. I learned about performativity from Judith Butler, and they would have us focus on the iterative quality of living, on the repetition of power, desire, virtues, vices, norms and habits and disposition. All of these exist through repetition. They are forms of activity. If we attend to how everyday life is dynamically constituted, if we attend to the iteration, we can perceive the spaces and moments in between each iteration. Paying attention. Attention itself is interrupted. And the small interruption of attention can lead to larger and longer interruptions. Interruptions of the flow of hegemonies that produce the effect of static identities in a seemingly static order. In this framework, resistance, another key word, occurs in naming the illusion, identifying the in-between spaces and moments, and repeating differently. Through resistance, we experience our vitality, even amidst lies and domination. This visceral knowledge undermines deadly structures and cultures and alters everyday interactions. Resistance as reality and agency also creates openings for new things to emerge. When we really know that hegemony has a history, we know that its future is not certain. We have psychic room to imagine alternatives. One mode for this psychic activity is spirituality, a key word. Spirituality can complement resistance by breathing life into the in-between spaces and moments. Stretching that which is in between, we can unfurl the reality of who we are, and we can tell the truth about what has happened. Iterating or repeating ourselves differently, we can better appreciate and increase our agency. We can honor, mourn, assess, strengthen, and celebrate our ways of being and knowing. This inspiration of spirituality can provide an opportunity for contrast, which is necessary for distinguishing between deadening and life-giving activity. Enlivening healing breath contrasts and thus highlights what is harmful or hindering. And that same breath gives us the capacity to project, to breathe out what is deadening. With this kind of spirituality, we know more deeply what we should resist, and we have more strength for resistance. Finally, ritual, our last key word. Ritual can sustain resistance in spirituality. Through the theory of performativity, ritual can be understood as that which lends stability to new ways of iterating life amidst the threat of death. Ritual holds together the dynamic activity of bodies, spirits, ways of being and knowing, and is one vehicle through which we can give and receive life. We do not need substantive theories of anthropology, culture, and religion to have stability. Iteration can provide continuity. The difference is that continuity does not come with hegemonic presets. A performative ritual is ever open to interruption, for better and for worse. It does not impose itself as eternal, timeless. It is aware, so to speak, of its own fragility and grateful for the fragments of life that it can gather and share. In contrast to the dominating flow of hegemonic time, the dynamic of iteration and interruption creates ebb and flow. It is realistic in that way. It does not pretend to march through history, much less a progressive one. All ritual is created through repetition. That is, rituals are most efficacious when they have happened before. Performative ritual harnesses this power of repetition in a way that fosters a proliferation of agents. Everyone is necessary to the ritual because it is essentially about participating together. It is not about showing up to gain access to an otherwise inaccessible substance. It is about what happens when we are together for the sake of life and truth. Performative ritual is about threading together the community's fragments of memory and hope. These rituals exist in and through relationships that recall the past in ways that renew the present and the future. I'd like to conclude with one lesson that I have learned from thinking about performativity. Before that, though, I want to say that for many of us, it is work and joy enough to perceive the cracks in hegemony and keep alive the small plants of resistance and spirituality that grow there. Everyone should learn to tend these incipient gardens. And indeed, our organizer has invited us to gather and sow seeds with the title of this colloquium. The lesson for me, maybe not for you, but for me, the lesson is this. We who are so eager for a bigger harvest, must be careful not to jeopardize these small things. We must resist any and all attempts to raise these gardens for the sake of larger landscapes, whether those landscapes are theological or decolonial or any great vision of praxis. Performativity teaches that there is no escaping coloniality, and yet there is resistance. Consider how Butler explained this theoretical point in a different context in the book Bodies That Matter. Quote, performativity describes the relation of being implicated in that which one opposes. This turning of power against itself to produce alternative modalities of power, to establish a kind of political contestation that is not a pure opposition, a transcendence of contemporary relations of power, but a difficult labor of forging a future from resources inevitably impure. Returning to coloniality and the plains. Lying, dominating forms of white European Christianity have grown into most, if not all, of our ecosystems. We cannot rely upon promises to uproot all forms of coloniality, and we need to resist the temptation of weed killers that have unintended consequences. We must cultivate without pure soil. This is disappointing every day, to say the least. But at the same time, we can be thankful that pure resources are not necessary to be fully alive. As I mentioned, I was reminded of this in a new way when I read that people who have experienced trauma, whether personal or collective, do not have the option of pure resources. This is indeed true for all living creatures, but traumatization makes the point acute. As living relational creatures, our experiences have material implications. Our bodies, spirits, ways of being and knowing are shaped by what happens. We cannot think or talk our way into new life. Change must involve everything that we already are and might be. People who want to heal from trauma and people who want to facilitate healing sometimes make an error of expectations. We want before, whatever that means, before the event, before the circumstances, before lack, before loss. The assumption behind this expectation is something like a psychic lost and found. We worry that if we are not what we were before, we are essentially less. I would say that performativity can help us to conceptualize loss anew. Without the starting point of substantive continuity, we do not shatter. Experiencing pain and suffering, even trauma, these are iterative happenings and they can be iterated differently. I do not want in any way to minimize experiences of loss of self, of splintering, of shattering, and indeed we can have a rich conversation about disassociation and integration in the technical terms of trauma. At the same time, I do want to claim that our conceptualizations of ourselves and our communities, our interpretations, can make these experiences of loss worse, or they can suggest thresholds for positive transformation. To say this again in a biblical register, with the psalmist, we can combine lamentation and thanksgiving. We can reject lies and domination while embracing reality and agency. Indeed, probably most of us have to do all of this in fits and starts and stumbles, but it can be done. I have been reflecting with you on performativity, given my current reading in trauma studies. I've also been reading about the history of rationalism. And so if you'll forgive me the reference to 17th century Germany, there once was a rationalist named Gottfried Leibniz. This diplomat and scholar sought a universal language based on mathematical symbolism to promote understanding and ecumenism amid emerging European nations. Leibniz is famous and infamous for the phrase, the best of all possible worlds. And then this is the best of all possible. That, dear audience, is a lie. It is a lie that would have us deny reality, a lie that confuses agency, a lie that corrupts spirituality and undermines resistance. Leibniz was trained in scholasticism before later in life reading modern philosophers like Descartes and Pascal. With his theory of the best of all possible worlds, he engaged the new modern ideas and upheld what were traditional, obvious attributes of God. That is, he upheld a way of being and knowing that is no longer obvious for Christians. Also, the tradition is more diverse than we do not have to deny reality or minimize human agency or valorize human agency in order to speak about God. And today, within and beyond Christianity, there are many ways to live and speak of spirituality and existence. Employing performativity is one starting point that allows for creativity within a given religious or ethical tradition. With reality and agency instead of lies and domination, people can truly create. Our activity matters for bodies, spirits, ways of being and knowing. Again, we know that every hegemony has a history, including religious and ethical hegemonies, and so the future is open. The future is open. In a world that exists through iteration, in a world where we can repeat ourselves differently, we can have an open future without a rationalist clean slate. Again, we can cultivate gardens, protect gardens, and wetlands, deserts, coastlines, mountains, plains, in and through existing impure resources. In and through the messed up and beautiful world that we actually have, we can make it so that everyone feels fully alive. It is not too much to ask. I know that feeling fully alive is not enough. It is not a replacement for justice, it's not a replacement for the fullness of love, but it is a visceral, fundamental starting. To be fully alive often requires change, but we can be this, even amidst ongoing lies and domination. We can be fully alive and revel in our present.
Thank you very much for that. Next, we have Professor Nelly Wamaitha. Wamaitha. Professor Wamaitha is, one second. Professor Wamaitha is Assistant Professor of Theology and International Studies at Boston College. Her areas of research and interest are the law and human rights, economic inequality, post-colonial theologies, and critical theory. Her work is an attempt to understand how colonial logics have been transmitted across time, and therefore how colonial logics sustain themselves to produce new forms of colonialism today. Everyone, welcome Professor Wamaitha.
Francis, good morning, everybody. It's really good to be here. Thank you for making it so early. I think and the project I want to talk to you about, I think, is really the work of fighting the lies that hide reality. Because I'm from Kenya, and I think for Africa, a lot of these stories have not yet been told, because the narrative. It's interesting how colonial power works. And its capacity to co-opt its critique and to escape it. So the critique that has been labeled, that has been leveled against the colonial, Europe's colonizing of history and narrative progress has been accepted, but so in such a minuscule way that it has actually not been accepted. So they have learned to not speak about civilizing Africans, so nobody will be saying, oh, we're trying to civilize this African, but that language has been transposed into the language of law and human rights. We are teaching them human rights. They need to adopt human rights. It's what the cultural derogation that used to happen has been now transcribed into political and economic language. So Africa is narrated, and the global South generally is narrated as lurking in mature political systems and in advanced economics policies that can sustain it in a modern world. It's the same old narrative of you're backward and we need to move forward. So what I'm trying to do is to tell a decolonial history of Kenya that goes against the colonial history that has been told about Kenya. And I do this by telling material histories of the colonial railway, the colonial law, and the independence constitution that were introduced to Kenya during the colonial period. I focus on the railway and the law and the independence constitution. In the previous life, I was a lawyer, because these have historically been empire's most proud bequeathals to the colonized world, and in particular to Africa, and believe in their capacity to deliver progress despite the evils of colonialism remains largely actually. You introduce these laws, you introduce human rights, you introduce constitutional forms of being, and these are still thought to be redemptive and something for Africa. So I try to tell a story. The colonial version of this history narrates colonial power as delivering moral, political, and economic progress to Kenya through the railway, the law, and the constitution. But I begin by questioning this story of progress, and I refuse to assume with colonial power that the colonial railway, the law, and the independence constitution were necessary for Kenya's progress, or that they did in fact deliver progress to the country. I attend instead to material history. I locate the railway, the law, and the independence constitution, not in the progressive history in which they are often located in colonial tradition, but in histories that pay attention to them as material realities with material effects on the Kenyans who experience them. So I flip the story and focus on the Kenyans who experience these things. And I highlight the fact of colonialism refusing to naturalize it as progress does, and I reject any essentialized ideas of infrastructure. What I want to pay attention to are the remakings that were happening in the colonial moment, because colonialism narrated, when it introduced the law to Kenya, as if we had no law before that, it narrated itself as moving this essence. The law becomes this essence that can move from Britain all the way to Kenya, or from India all the way to Kenya. And what is denied in that moment are the colonial remakings of what law is that are happening in that moment, so that the law becomes identical with the ends of imperial power. For instance, the law that they introduced in, I focus on the labor laws that they introduced there. And of course, the focus of that was to turn us into laborers for the colonial government and for the plantations that they set up, the colonial plantations that they set up in Kenya. And so the purpose of the law became to transform the lazy, idle African into a laborer for wages. You can see how there the law is aligning thoroughly with the ends of empire. But it's a fundamental change to make the ends of the law the ends of empire. That is not narrated. It's not narrated as such. So I'm trying to tell this history is under history. It is ugly. It is full of death, and it is full of violence. All of them. The railway, the law, the constitution. When you pay attention to what had to happen to the Africans for this to be set up, the violence and the impacts, the story. And I didn't know this until I said research, but they say that Kenya's population in the past 25 years of colonial population reduced by 25%. That's the death of people in millions. But we don't even have a legal term for what that is. What is that? It's not genocide. What is it? We don't have it. It's hard to trace when there's such systematic violence that the population of a country, which is supposed to be growing within 25 years, so we never know where it has been, was actually reduced by 25%. So the inscription of the railway, the law, and the constitution within the myth of progress made them ideological. They joined the railway, the law, the constitution. They joined colonial power in formulating subjugating constructions of Kenya and Kenyans, and demanding the political, social, and economic forms that imperial powers in the process of establishing in Kenya. So these things that are supposed to be salvific are actually involved in the process of demanding exactly what empire requests. An interesting one is the independence constitution. And this is something, I mean, the West may have fakely repented about other things, but they have not repented for this constitution. They're proud of them. We introduced liberal democracy to this nation, and we left them with the capacity to survive in the liberal democratic era. It's all hogwash, because what was going on, and we can tell the answer, but it really is. The constitution, the process of negotiating Kenya's independence constitution. First of all, it is a ridiculous thing that the drafting of Kenya's constitution, people who were in the colonialists were in the room and had say in what goes into that. In fact, they had more than say. They dictated the form of it. And one of the things they intended to do, they were keen to do, because Kenya was a settler colony where and white people used to live there, was they were very interested in the property that had been acquired in Kenya. And they were not going to leave that room until the constitution would be a guarantor of those property rights. So the Bill of Rights was introduced, in fact, for the protection of those property rights, and to ensure that Kenya remains inscribed within the economic system that needs property to be commodified in the way that it was commodified. It was a life-giving thing for me to be able to say concretely that there really was no landlessness in my country among my people until colonialism came. And because of our understandings of property, there was no room for landlessness in that way. There was room for a bit of difference in wealth, but none for landlessness at all. This was introduced by the redefinition of land and property that happened in the colonial period. And the condition for Kenya's independence was the continuation of this commodification of land. The other condition Kenya's independence was the continuation of the debt relationship that was introduced through the railway. So the colonialists needed to construct the colonial railway in order to set up their own empire. But they narrated it as a debt to Kenya because the railway was inevitably going to pull Kenya into the 20th century economically. And the condition, again, so Kenya was set up by debt. In fact, it was set up for the purposes of bearing debt. And the condition of its independence was that it had to take a new debt from Britain to purchase back the land that Britain had stolen from it. So the condition of our independence was the continuation of this colonial debt relationship, which we know has never been lifted for any of these formerly colonized countries. It's an ugly, ugly. So that's the work that I have been doing and the stuff that has been causing me a lot of grief. It is to witness the death of your ancestors, some of which I didn't know. At this scale, I had no clue. Like the grief and the loss, it's just so real, and which is why I feel the stories need to be told, because we don't know. Because once you're denied language for things, how do you talk about them? You know, you have to try and find this language. So there's a story of progress that colonial power narrates. But since Kenya attained independence in 1963, it has also been tempting even by Africans, to tell a story of progress about Kenya, extolling the achievements of heroic Kenyan resistance to colonial rule. And colonialism loves this story. These heroes of colonialism who overcame colonial rule, because then it sustains the lie that there was some kind of overcoming that was effective. And there was on some level, but also there was. In this story, Kenya used to be colonized, but was successfully decolonized. This narrative goes on to optimistically assert that the attainment of independence was the first step in a series of coming progressive changes that will ensure that Kenya, now under indigenous African rule, would attain peace and prosperity for all. But a story about the triumph of African resistance and Kenya's advance past colonial domination also lies, because it hides the ways in which African colonization efforts were constrained and frustrated by political power. So this is what I do. So I tell this story, and it is really not a story of Africans winning. On some level, it is a story of a deep defeat. But that's not all. I want to listen to the Africans and what was going on in that moment. So I listened to the resistances of Africans in Kenya in my tenure of Kenya's history. And I hear certain things. So in their insistence by Africans that the White Highlands was stolen, that land was stolen, that was not just a moral claim, but a legal one. By calling the taking of African land by the British colonial administration and white settlers theft, they are insisting that the property law has been breached and that the act was criminal. It is a pronouncement that the legislator is the criminal. This is a deep negation of the existing legal system and land rights it establishes. The Africans spoke as those operating under different law. The use of the legal term stolen amounts to a rejection of the legitimacy of the law that calls European appropriation of Kenyan land legal acquisition and not theft. It is the assertion of a higher law by which colonial law was found to not be law. There is an alternative understanding of law in the lack of codification of African law. These are the things that have been stolen, the lost things that we mourn and wonder what we do about before the coming of colonial power. And this perception of law was porous to history and politics, and it paid attention to the voices of the living and the dead. And that was in this refusal of rigidity and this maintenance of porosity, a certain foundational conviction about the connection between the law and its people. But, and this is the thing, I have to proceed with the awareness that Africans were themselves formed and constrained by colonialism, even as they resisted and navigated it. Colonialism shrunk the phrase that Africans agitating for freedom work with. And you can see this in the fight for independence in the 1960s. The frames had been thoroughly shrunk. What colonialism had managed to hide, that it was a global project of a massive political and economic power. And it narrated itself only as the usurping of national power. So decolonization became the granting of national freedom without doing anything about the political and economic inequalities that existed in the global order. And the Africans, they were asking for it, but they weren't asking for it so intently because their frames had been shrunk, but also because there was a very immediate violence that they were trying to attend to and that called for all of their attention. And Africans in the whole process were forced to make concessions to imperial power that were consequential. So, I want to say that Africans were involved in a negation more fundamental than the results of decolonization show. They were engaged in a refusal of colonial domination that existed what they could articulate, and sometimes even exceeded what they could imagine. And so I turn to I want to perceive Africa's strongest negations of imperial power. I want those to guide me. And sometimes I hear a resistance that exceeded what they at times had language. I try to pay attention, not to what worked, but to their highest aspirations, their deepest yearning, their strongest no to empire, attempting to hear it even when the system refuses them language. Now, I refuse the impoverished language and the limited frame which colonial powers afforded the subaltern to silence her deepest yearnings. I hear many of them as a whisper, not easily caught. Others I find in my own sadness over this history and in my own dreams. I listen as one listening for spirit, for groans and moans, articulating yearnings and dreams and griefs for which the subaltern has no breathing language. And thinking about this, I ask myself, because I've lived in Kenya and I've lived among before, and I have been poor myself, and think about what is it that sustains in this dehumanizing condition. And I want to tell you a little about this phrase in my language. It's gaitimodo, but it means that God is not man. This is a statement. I want to put it in the category of the proclamations, where it's that Jesus makes that the kingdom of God is at hand. It's just that, a proclamation. I don't even think it can even be described as a ritual. It's just a proclamation, but people say it so often. It is usually the statement that the poor person or the oppressed person say to the person in power or the person oppressing them at the moment of their defeat. And at the moment of the defeat, the subaltern utters that God is not one. That's the statement. That's all they have at that moment. I know this statement best in Kikuyu as gaitimodo, but there are many iterations of the same proclamation in many Kenyan languages. In its various forms, gaitimodo can be translated as God is not man. But this translation is already distorted, because Kikuyu, like Kiswahili and most East African language, is not gendered like English. God is not human, does not quite capture the particularities of that, but it's not gendered. And this is the wonderful thing about this, because we say it in our original language. And you know the story of translation and how the British came to Africa and gendered our ungendered God, and personified our unpersonified spirits, all that destructive work that was done. So, but when I go back to my language, the pronouns drop off, and I can speak of God in this way. And also because this language is pre-Christian, the Muslim, the African traditional religious person, the person who has converted to Buddhism, we all are speaking about the richness of God in our tradition, but we have a shared language for it. And we understand that because this language is pre the introduction of it. It really is a rich thing. We all say it. Muslims, Africans, people, we just all say it. The statement can be had in common conversations. There are songs about their proverbs, their sayings. It's a common hashtag on Twitter and other social media. It has been the title of a TV series. Now, gaitimodo is, for me, I read it as a negative theology and an eschatology. It is a complex eschatological statement in that it speaks both of the present and the future. There's a popular song that says, "My God is not man to lie like man. That is why I have hope that my tomorrow is good. You have made me an heir in your kingdom so that I can rejoice while on this earth and when I get to heaven." Gaitimodo is a versatile theological statement. It is born out of moments of helplessness in the face of human evil and is usually deployed in the face of gross injustice. It is also used in celebration, especially when someone receives something good despite hardship or achieves something that their enemies would not wish for them. In confrontation with power, when it is uttered to someone in power, Gaitimodo are fighting words, uttered often angrily and as a threat. God's coming. Gaitimodo can be a statement of confrontation or be spoken as one retreats from confrontation. It makes a declaration about God, who is not in the now, about who God is, not in the now, but who God is in the now, but it also testifies, it makes a statement about who God is in the now, but it also testifies about the future. The statement contains within it hope in a future in which the God who is not mad will act to rescue God's people. The unspoken promise of Gaitimodo is that the injustice that provokes the statement is not final because man is not final. And man is not final because there is a God, and that God is not man. The suffering that the poor has to endure is an event in a history in which the God who is not man is the ultimate actor. And this is an affront to empire, which narrates itself as ultimate. And here the subaltern is saying, no, God is ultimate. Gaitimodo insists that the kingdoms of man are not final despite their pretensions to be. It testifies that there is a God who is not man, who will ultimately triumph over evil man, and is triumphing even now because their pretensions, man has not become God for Gaitimodo. History becomes then not a story about the progress of colonialism, but a story about God's redemption as God works in and through his people. Now, this Gaitimodo does not automatically produce emancipatory politics. It is sometimes used to affirm a historicized eschatology in which God's salvation is not expected in this world, but in an immaterial spiritual world to come. So it's like a lot of things that we do. It is a mixed bag, and it depends on how it is utilized. It is a mixed theology in that it can be used to justify inaction in the world as well as action for freedom. It is sometimes employed by those in power to garner, even the people in power, they use, politicians love this statement, to defend themselves when they are accused of corruption and that sort of thing. And they sort of will call on this phrase as a defense for them. But as James Coney taught us, Black theologian is an interpreter of the religious imagination of Black people. And Gaitimodo, even in its distortion and co-optation, testifies to the deep and ongoing longings of the poor for a salvation that they know can only come from a God who is not man. The big claim I want to make here, and what I have learned from studying this terrible violence and death-dealing history, is that colonialism is a theological project. The colonialism aims to be creator. The colonial power cannot bear to live in a world in which they have not created and structured. That's the goal of colonialism, to be the creator, and to be this ultimate thing. And the power, and so I look for, and so the power in this statement is that it denies this lie of creating of the colonialism, that they are ultimate. They cannot. So for me, the resistance, because colonialism advances a theology of history, and a theology of time, and a claim to be God. We need to counter it with better theologies about history, about time, about humanity, about all of these things that we're trying to welcome. It will not do. I think it is insufficient to. I think we respond insufficiently to colonialism when we fail to attempt to use theologies, when we fail to attempt to accompany theological undertaking. So what I invite us to, and what I see in this statement, Gaitimodo, is eschatological hope. A hope that is eschatological. And eschatological hope refuses the finality to everyone but God. This is what colonialism wants to claim for itself. We have figured out what the law is. We have now come to teach you what the law is. We have figured out what Christianity is. We have now come to teach you what Christianity is. We know what constitutions are. We have now come to teach you about what constitutions are. It's acclaiming to be final, that they have the final word on what these very important ideas and concepts and realities are for the world. But when we cling to this eschatological hope that declares that God is not mad, then we are refusing the finality to everyone but God. And it destroys the self-assuredness, or it has the capacity to destroy the self-assuredness of the white Western world. But even the subaltern is denied finality. If we are not to be satisfied with anything other than the redemption that comes from God, we need history that can transcend what even the subaltern can presently accomplish in her own life, seeking instead to see in the light of the redemption that comes from the God who's not bad. And the efforts of the subaltern should be instructed by that light of that redemption. Refusing finality to all but God is what cause to avoid totalitarianism. And like imperial power, which confidently pronounces the law, prescribes the form of the constitution, and constructs and structures the reality, a decolonial ethic must be circumspect with prescriptions and pronouncements of it. Must be very careful. You cannot be as sure, because one of the sins of colonialism, it is always sure, it already knows. The decolonial resists bold proclamations about the future that the subaltern should seek. Where empires were brazen before the African, the decolonial, animated by eschatological hope, trembles before these children of God. Because eschatological hope invites us both to testify to the redemption in whose light and light we live now, and to live in expectation of God's promise to redeem. The practice of eschatological hope and the writing of eschatological histories gives boldness to pursue nothing less than the coming of God's kingdom. Hoping in God and not in man, we are emboldened to speak devastating truths without becoming legalistic. Eschatological hope frees up the critique in our eschatological histories to be radical, because our hope is radical. To hope eschatologically is to have enlightened imagination that are not exhausted by what currently exists.
Thank you very much for that reflection, Professor Wamaitha. So for the last presentation on our Conversatorio on Descolonial rituals, performativity, and resistance, we have Professor Aída Hernández. Rosalba Aída Hernández Castillo is a professor and senior researcher at the Centro de Investigaciones y Estudios Superiores en Antropología Social in Mexico City. Since her undergraduate days, Hernández Castillo has combined her academic work with feminist activism and with projects in radio, video, and journalism. Her academic work has promoted indigenous and women's rights in Latin America. Her research interest covers indigenous studies, legal and political anthropology, descolonial feminism, and activist research. Fernando Castillo is the author of Multiple Injustices, Indigenous Women, Law, and Political Struggle in Latin America, and the co-editor of Transcontinental Dialogue, Activist Alliances with Indigenous People of Canada, Mexico, and Australia. She is now a visiting fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies at Harvard University, where she is working in her book on a book manuscript called Digging for Hope in Mexico, a feminist ethnography in the land of mass graves. They'll offer an ethnographic account of family left searching for disappeared loved ones throughout Mexico. Hernández Castillo did her undergraduate studies in the Escuela Nacional de Antropología y Historia in Mexico City and earned her doctorate in anthropology from Stanford University. She has received the Lhasa Axpan America Martin Diskin Memorial Lecturici for her activist research and the Simone Beauvoir Chair from the University of Cambridge, as well as the Buenaventura de San Sosotas Chair in Social Studies from the University of Coimbra. Well, thank you very much, Professor. And here you go.
Well, I'm waiting, and it seems like we have some technical problems there. Well, I would have been waiting. I first want to thank Carlos Mendoza for inviting me, and I think that this interdisciplinary dialogues is what we are needing. See here, historian, theology, legal anthropology, and also feminist activist. And what I want to share with you today is a presentation that I have entitled incarnated feminist theology, women resisting violence and disappearance, and are the lessons that I have learned doing activist research with collectives of relatives of disappeared people in Mexico. And I talk about incarnated feminist theology because I believe that what they are doing with their bodies in the field is a way of teaching us a different way of theology. And in that sense, of decolonize what are we considering theology. That theology is not just being produced in institutions as this one, but it's also being produced in the fields, in the streets, in the mass graves. And that it is important for us to decenter our perspective of what are we understanding as theology, to be able to learn the lessons that are being taught in this specific moment in different places in the world where different subaltern sectors are struggling to defend and dignify life. And I prepared a beautiful PowerPoint with a lot of images. Okay. Well, just beginning with this image, is a retreat that we had just before I came here with the colectivo Regresando a Casa Morelos in the state of Morelos, where I live. So it was a retreat that was organized with them and with an ecumenical perspective with the Anglican Church, feminist nuns, Mennonites, members of the Mennonite Church, and people of other spiritualities. And I want to start while I tell you a little bit about this. And my attempt is to share the spiritual path and my way back to faith in my work with families of disappeared. It has been the mother, wife, sisters of disappeared persons who have once again shown me the way back to the calling. I have been in Marxist feminists all my life, and it was only the last 6 years that working with them, I have been discovering these other theologies that are very appealing, inspiring for me. And just to give you some context of the place where these theologies are being produced, we have now 500,000 murdered persons during the so-called war, narco war. Those are official numbers. 112,232 disappeared persons for official data. It is 3 times what we have in the South Congo in the dictatorships. 53 unidentified bodies in the state common graves. Those are bodies that are under the custody of the state that have not been recognized yet. We have 70,000 Central American immigrants that disappeared in their path through Mexico, and 4,806 clandestine mass graves. So it is in this context that the women that I work with are producing this inherent feminist theology. But every time that I talk about these issues, I feel a little bit uncomfortable. I was thinking in Nelly's presentation that when I'm in the US context, people can think, oh, well, this is a result of a failure state, of weak institutions. It is great that we have this beautiful democratic state where we don't have this kind of violence. So it is important for me just to make a parenthesis and say how this reality is so linked to the global militarism that is being promoted from empire that has very important space here in the United States. Just as an example, the Fast and Furious operation was an operation in which the US gave weapons to the cartels with the idea of following the weapons, and they lost track of these weapons. So a lot of those weapons are being used to kill people in Mexico. And they said that one of the most bloodiest cartels was made by elite troops that were trained during the Central American War, that were trained in the School of the Americas in the US. And now a lot of this technology of terror and torture was learned in this. So your reality and our reality are much more linked than what we sometimes realize. And from a global perspective, I'm not going to stop in a lot of these theoretical debates because I wanted to get to the incarnate theology. But people have, from a systemic analysis, linked this, the name, the way that colonialism takes in this context as gore capitalism that is linked to the narco violence, and talking about the feminist, the Mexican feminist like Valencia, or the necropolitics concept that the Cameroonian philosopher actually Mbembe has popularized in Latin America to describe how the subjugation of life to the powers of death, or the concept of cruel modernity by the British literary critic Gianfranco. But a lot of this systemic analysis, although they are inspiring, they left you with hopeless. It's like, what can we do with such a systemic forces of death? And I feel that with an ethnographic feminist activist approach to this extreme violence, we are able to get closer to these local experiences of resistance, allows to see the quotidian manifestations of resistance. And in these quotidian manifestations of resistance, I have seen and documented the pedagogy of love that is confronting the pedagogy of terror. And I'm gonna go deeper into this later. There is a concept that the Argentinian feminist Rita Laura Segato, the pedagogy of terror, has popularized, and I'm trying to develop this conception of pedagogy of love to have a debate with her. And also allow us to see the role of faith and spirituality in the reconstruction of community. Having this dialogue with Rita Laura, she uses the concept pedagogy of terror by saying that the bodies are symbols in a semantic of patriarchal violence. And what I'm seeing in this work of the searchers, of the relatives of the families, are that the bodies of the sons and daughters of these women are becoming now members of the civic and spiritual community. When they recover these bodies, they are bringing them back to the civicness. And she says that disappearance, massacres, and mass graves have a pedagogical objective. They are teaching us something. And this is to promote fear, to impose terror as forms of territorial control of the organized crime with the complicity of the security forces. And what I find is that the exhumations that these collectives are doing are confronting this pedagogy with a pedagogy of love. Is confronting the silence, making the silence worse, is naming the silence. And disappearance as a continuum of psychological torture that promotes silence, they are promoting discourses and practices to confront this pedagogy. This movement is made mainly by women. And I want to point that why I feel that feminism is so relevant. Just basic data. More than around 99% of the perpetrators of this violence, security forces, organized crime, are men. And around 90% of the searchers that are taking care of the consequences of this violence are women. So I think that just by seeing that there must be something that we can think about the origin of patriarchal violence and linked to this context. These are two spaces in which these collectives are. There are around 450 collectives in Mexico of women that are searching for their disappeared people in all Mexico. And another decolonizing mover is a decolonization of the hierarchies of knowledge, because these women are appropriating forensic knowledge to search for their relatives. They are going to the mass graves and they are digging for their families. And they are finding more persons than all these huge apparatuses. This is Mirna Medina from Las Rastreadoras in the north of Mexico, and her organization had found 160 bodies and had been able to return 90 of them, to recognize them and to return them, to give them a dignified burial and to send them back to their families. And what they have done in this search for the relatives is using their identities as mothers, and they have been very much criticized by some sectors of feminism, in the case of the Mothers de la Plaza de Mayo. But what I found here is that they are redefining mother, because they have shifted from los buscaremos hasta te buscaré hasta encontrarte, por los buscaremos hasta encontrarlos. I will look for you until I find you. We will look for you until we find you all. So a lot of those women that are searching for their kids have already found the bodies of their own kids, but they keep searching because they're all of them are considered their kids. And in this search, the spiritual and the ritual element has been so important. I've talked about how they are sacralizing the clandestine mass graves, transforming extermination camps into sacred territories. Those two images are two different mass graves. The one in the right is a mass grave that was found with 12 bodies in the last national movement, or I'm going to talk a little bit about it, of the National Brigade, in which these 450 organizations get together and go to one place to help the local organizations in their search. And what they did is that they went to this place that is named by them as extermination camps, because many times these mass graves, when they keep getting doing the exhumation, they find more and more bodies. So they did this beautiful spiritual ecumenical ritual and put a cross in the top of the mass grave, because they were not only placing the bodies that they were being found, the human beings, because they are not human remains anymore, but human beings, but they were placing the land that also had been violent with these aggressions. And the second one is in an state common mass grave that was discovered to be used in a clandestine way. So an state mass grave was found as with bodies that had been tortured. It's a long story. I have a presentation about this specific and single. So they went to this mass grave, and they also have this special ritual to place the land there. And in this walking through the searches in the country, it has been created the access of churches and spiritualities of the National Search Brigade. That is the communities of faith of different kind of denominations have get together as a citizen initiative to work with the disappeared person. And so the ecumenical and spirituality access is formed by relatives of disappeared people and by people that work in solidarity with them, linked to some different denominations or without denomination, people of faith that consider that we have a responsibility because all those the men and women that are waiting to be found are also our relatives, are also our family. So once a year, organizations from the entire country choose one state, and they all come with their own funding and stay in their own houses to do searches. Those, I don't have time to talk more about this, but they search not just on them, but online. We go to prisons, we go to hospitals, we go to addiction centers, we go to schools, to community centers. So during 2 weeks, we all work in this search. And one part of the search is to go to different churches. We are also searching not just for the discipline, but for the human beings that are being indifferent in those religious communities. And one of the issues that the access of religious and spiritualities have done, and it's a commitment, is to put the body in the field. It's not just to accompany them to the safe places like community churches, but to go to the exhumation mass graves with them. And when we put the body in what is called búsqueda de campo, field search, and in the mass graves, it's a way for us to learn of this loving care for the dead, of this incarnate theology that they are producing there. It has the churches of Moderator are working with the families of the disappeared people, and this is one of the mass graves, and we're in a search there where we have 2 bodies. So what some of the creative strategies for searching that they have developed is what is called los buzones de paz, the mailboxes of peace. And what it is that we take a mailbox to different communities, schools, religious institutions, and we invite the people to give a message of peace in some of these mailboxes. But also, if they have any information about a place where they can be buried with burial clandestine mass graves, or a place where people can be retained against their will. It can be anonymous. They always say, we are not searching for the responsible of this violence, we are searching for our kids. And it's not that they don't want justice, it's that under their actual conditions, it's not safe to be as looking for the perpetrators. They want to recover their kids. So in this message, in these boxes, we have found messages with maps to find clandestine mass graves. It has been a very effective strategy because it's anonymous, safe, but also we find the voices of people that their hearts have been moved by them. So we can see also how their message in those communities is raising consciousness and awareness. And another of the initiatives that we have is a spiritual space of listening and emotional accompaniment that is called Las Comunidades Escucha. So every Wednesday rains or if it's a holiday, we get together through Zoom with families of all the country just to listen to them. We are not psychologists, it's not a therapy, the space is the space of listening. And in this space of listening, we are also learning from them. We're also learning of the case of the type of peace-building activities that they are doing. Because besides searching for their relatives, they are going to high schools, to elementary schools, to give talks. So the energy that they need with the trauma and the pain that they have the energy to go and try to do prevention work in schools and communities. So they make a balance of the week, what they have done, where they went, how they were listening. So of their search in the field for the kids and of the search of the souls of the human beings that are indifferent through this crisis. And they are also not just producing incarnate theology with their bodies in the field, they are also writing. And this is amazing because many of those women have elementary school, they are rural teachers, they are domestic workers, but they have appropriated writing as a way to also produce. This is a pamphlet that we did it with their reflections on the Buenaventuranzas of Mateo's evangelist. And this is Maria Herrera, a woman that is searching for 4 of her kids. And she reflects in one of the Buenaventuranzas, blessed are those who are hungry of thirst and justice, for they shall be satisfied. So she answered with these reflections, gives me reason for hope and strength. These words, if we make them our own, if we assume them in what we live as relatives of disappeared loved ones, they should fill us with joy and peace. God has his time. He knows when and how. He has never left us alone. So it is very interesting how they answer, how they respond, how they appropriate, but also how they decide. This pamphlet was distributed by them during this, in 2020, during the 6th National Brigade. And they are also, I have been also accompanied through creative writing workshops in dialogues of knowledge, their desire to write their experiences. And to do this, we have developed an exchange. I don't have time here, but an exchange with a collective of women that had been in prison with whom I have been working for 15 years. The collective that had published these 2 books is called Sisters in the Shadows. So the ex-prison women have coordinated the creative writing workshops with myself, 2 of them and I. And as a product of these creative writing workshops, they have published 2 books that I have now with me, Nadie Detiene el Amor, that was written by the collective in the north of Sinaloa. And this that it was just published a few weeks before I came here, that is called Sanadoras de Memoria, and in which they, in Nadie Detiene el Amor, it was memory workshops, so they write about the continuum of violence that had marked their territories, their racialized territory, racialized geographies, because a lot of the bodies that are being found in the mass graves are racialized young men and women. Not all of them will recognize themselves as indigenous, but they have indigenous background because the Mexican society is terribly racialized in those terms. And so what they write in this book, in these life stories, it's also a theorization about what is going in Mexico, because they show us that there is a continuity of dispossession, that many of them have been displaced before they disappear, is of the continuum of violence in which the disappearance take place. So in that case, I was thinking in the presentation of Dubois before, for them, trauma is not going back to the before, healing trauma is not going back to the before the grievance, because this context of before is part of the grievance, because it's what had allowed the disappearance to happen. So healing means also the transformation of the pre-disappearance context that allowed this disappearance to happen. And in this Sanadoras de Memoria, the first one was life stories, and the second one is poetic. They have been writing poetry, and I took the liberty of translating one of the poems that I love, that was written by Esperanza Sanchez. She's searching for Emilio Zavala, her son, who disappeared in the lagoon of Chacagua in Oaxaca, in the state of Oaxaca. And I just want to read because I want to make her voice present here. Today I ride with an open mind, without fear, without shame, leaving behind those roots and taboos, breaking skins and ties, free of ghosts with my face forward. Today I ride with firm and sure steps, opening and clearing paths. Today I ride to my inner self. I ride to my body full of my loving energy, wrapped in the crystalline mantle where my companions are, my sisters, all of those radiating light, harmony, tranquility, happiness, and sisterhood. Today I ride to my God-Goddess, to my Mother Earth, who have given me light, energy, and consciousness, that has given me inspiration, strength, and has changed with its colors much of my sadness, that has taken my bitterness and made me a prisoner in her chest, transforming my sadness into power and fragrance. Today I write. So I get chills when I read this. So what I see here is an incarnated theology. I see in these poems first a conception of a neutral God, a God that is a God and a goddess, a God that is a Mother Earth, but also a love that considered self-love. I was reading Multitude the other day by Hardy, and he's talking about this integral conception of love that is not selfish, it's always giving. And when I was reading him, I was thinking the feminist path of the importance of self-love, that is not just an individualistic. And it's very interesting because she's talking about that. She's talking about her body full of loving energy. So she's also considering her own body. Because they have a saying that autocuidado también es una forma de buscar. It says self-care is also a form to search. Because if you're sick, you are not going to be able to go out and search for your loved ones and for all the kids that were missing. Porque los desaparecidos nos faltan a todos, todas. So I just finishing with a call that Maria Angelica Rodriguez Monroy, who is there, says the Catholic hierarchies have not been up to the challenge of the disappearance in Mexico. We are still waiting for them to wake up and commit to our struggle. And they are still waiting. So I hope that my words here can help to awake this commitment. Here is Maria Herrera with the Pope in several months ago. And well, they are going wherever they have to go to try to destabilize these hierarchies and raise consciousness. And I finish with the same image because this is now my community of hope, my inspiring community, and the theologies that I respect the most. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that, Professor Hernandez. So we will now shift into the next moment where our Escuchador, Professor Nelson Maldonado-Torres, will come up and offer his own reflection on Heather Dubois' kind of Descolonial search for performativity within moments of colonialism, for Professor Wamaitha's fascinating reflection on Gaikimoto, or God is not man, and Professor Hernandez's incarnational theology based within the people that disappeared. So Professor Maldonado-Torres, and then if the panelists can also come up as well, that'd be very helpful. As we continue our Conversatorio on Descolonial rituals, resistance, and performativity. Of course, yeah.
Thank you, and many thanks for the wonderful presentations. It is really, it has been a pleasure listening to you, and then also being able to think with you and sharing some of those ideas with you and those of us here this morning. And I wanted, to share some reflections with you, more or less in the order in which you spoke, so beginning with Professor Dubois, who sort of offered a reflection highlighting some of the key terms that had already been selected, right, for the table for all of us. And so thinking about performativity, resistance, spirituality, and ritual, right? And I was thinking that one of the issues that I would like to put on the table, or the challenges with these categories, I think, is that there might be a fundamental ambiguity to all of these concepts, which allow them to be applied in so many different situations and contexts, and potentially could be used to spread counter decolonial attitudes. And I wonder also the extent to which there are plenty of theological concepts, kenosis, messianism, eschatology, eschatological hope, that are also fundamentally ambiguous, and something they sound important, they sound as decolonial concepts, but only within the specific context and discussion and content that is given to the larger, right, and that by themselves. They could also be mobilized in another direction, serving other purposes. And so the question is, I think that what I think the framework of coloniality and decoloniality offers is more, there is an effort to maintain all these concepts in a particular direction, right? But by themselves, again, they can be broad and ambiguous. For example, even this concept of resistance by itself, right? You can think of right-wing white nationalists who are resisting liberalism and white genocide, right? So the question of a framework is very important, right? The question of a framework. That is the thing is what, with Maria Lugones, who's, as I was saying yesterday, theorizing about intersectionality, connecting it with the framework of coloniality and decoloniality, she can then make more sense of how, there are intersections, but what is the logic that explains the intersections, right? What is the direction? And that's where she brings that framework. And within that, then she creates more innovations to the very thinking about coloniality and decoloniality, showing a creative implication. So I'm trying to think, what would that be? She did it with these other categories, for example, all the time. She did it with intersectionality, what would be for performativity, resistance. I was thinking also that, and this relates to, I think, the ambiguity of these concepts. And also, I think it allows me to connect with the second presentation. And it has something to do with Judith Butler, who's major, built from her work, and she's a major theorist of performativity and gender, more things. And I have an anecdote to share. It's an anecdote that it happened like more than 2 years ago, but I recently kind of wrote about it, reflected it in an essay that came out a couple of years ago. But before doing that, before saying that anecdote, I want to underline the respect that I have for the activist vein in Butler's work. When I was in the University of California, Berkeley, we coincided in the organizing against the investment of public education there, right? I know him from that work organizing. And also, I also respect particularly her being vocal in terms of the opposition to the ongoing genocide of the Palestinian population and her critique of the state of Israel. And she's now, for example, among others, right, supporting the creation of a recent space called the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism, that is having now in a couple of weeks its inaugural kind of conference. And Palestinian scholar Rabat Al-Bulhadi has been one of the major leaders in that venture. She has a long history, particularly bringing women of color together. She took a delegation of women of color, indigenous and women of color, to Palestine, including Angela Davis, for example, in 2011, and in 2021 they reconvened, and so on. And so it strikes me, I recently was in Palestine myself, and I cannot tell you I cannot tell you the nausea that you feel where, in face of so much systematic violence, but also when you find Christian tourists coming, right, to visit the Holy Land, right, and all that, right? And I am thinking that, shouldn't it, and that the US is one of the main supporters of engineers of the state of Israel. So I'm wondering if one can talk and write and think about doing anything like liberation theology in the US context without direct, concerted, organized efforts at denouncing what the state of Israel has been doing and the genocide of Palestine. Right? So I think particularly, what would that be for the Jesuit University, for example, right? How seriously can we think and write about all these kind of issues when, there are, of course, US power is all around, right? It's all around. But when, particularly, you're talking with Christians, right? There is a particular connection between Christianity and Jerusalem and the Holy Land, right? And if you have a position of authority in Christian circles, right? You're producing knowledge, theological knowledge, in a context that is supported, how not? So before I say that, I want to bring out, that Butler is one of those who have come out. And, there are prices to pay when you do that in the US. And I think that Christians taking the lead there, given this connection between Christianity also supporting the state of Israel, Protestants in the US, but not only, that is something very important when thinking about decoloniality in the US context. Now, having said that, I also interacted with Judith Butler in a faculty group, and we were discussing critical theory. Right, we were thinking about how to create a program, kind of a program, a certificate, graduate certificate in critical theory. And I was one of the faculty who was convened to think about this. What about 11 or 12 of us through a semester? We were thinking about all of that. And I had the opportunity there, right, of me coming, doing Africana philosophy, Afro-Caribbean philosophy, Latin American, right, bringing some of the ideas from that corner, and of course, many times being kind of rejected, pushed out. And actually, I remember Judith Butler was one of the ones who always tried to open the space for plurality of views. But I remember that there was one time when, I also respected her for that, but there was one time where I saw the limits of and what this ambiguity can do and allows to do. Because there was a moment when I said, well, we were talking about critical theory, grounded, and the main idea being kind of pushed by some in the seminar, the hegemonic form of critical theory. The critical theory is grounded on the concept of critique that were part of the European Enlightenment and then the aftermath, right? So at one point, it was so strong, this narrative, that at one point I decided to quote a line from Fanon's Brochure of the Earth, where Fanon said something along the lines, and this is the way I convey it. Fanon says, being in the Algerian Revolution in North Africa, that the Algerian basically did not have to wait for the French to know what criticism or what critique was. Right? And I remember that at that moment, right, I think that I was crossing a line that even my dear colleague, Dubois, was not going. It was like, so far I have supported many of your claims. That one, I know. And what I realized is that what is at stake is this, that you can actually defend, the idea of inclusion and diversity, right? But that can still harbor the notion that as long as you recognize that the origin of what you're doing is traced back to us, to this theory. So we can think about the glorification of these theories in multiple ways, but it's something else to think that out of Europe, there were these forms, right, that could be articulated. And that points to the kind of idea about Africa that was mentioned before. And that's what I think, again, that the framework always is there trying to prevent that we commit these slips, right, that we do this. And that we need to have very clear, coloniality and decoloniality, that there is fundamental structure of power that is conditioning us to think in these ways to begin with, and to limit the radicality of our claims, of our positions. When I was thinking about the theology, I wanted to think about this notion with which I very much agree, that colonization is a theological project. And when I was listening some of the reflections by Professor Wamaitha, I was going back to a couple of ideas that I kind of worked on also about 15 years ago. And they were about, I was thinking about, that for Hegel, there is, the famous dialectic of bondman, of a slave and bondsman. And he's saying, well, that they somehow, there is a failed process of recognition and so on and so forth in that process of a slave and master. But through Fanon engages the dialectic critically, and Fanon says that the slavery, the master really was not looking for the recognition of the slave, historically the historical slave, because the slave is this completely dispensable. And so I raise the question, well, how is it that then the master obtains some kind of recognition? And what I offer there is that the master projects an imperial God that gives the recognition. But then the very project, the master seeks to take the place of that God itself. And the imperial project is right. The historical project of imperialism and coloniality can be read in theological terms in that way. Also, Fanon, Fanon, the Brochure of the Earth, in French is Le Damné de la Terre, Damné, the condemned of the earth. And there's also, I think, a theological reading of that can be done, because that has to do with also things that you mentioned. Because the root of damné is common with the word donner, which is to give. And so being condemned, damné, is the condition of someone who cannot give because what they have has been taken away. And so you can see coloniality as a form of perpetrating, that damnation. And so, of course, then the master posits itself as the privileged giver. Always give, right? So the problem with imperialism is not only extraction, that's part of it. And, we have discussed extractivism across the planet. It's also this conserving the monopoly of giving, having the last word, right? We gave you the railway, we gave you civilization, we gave you the law, and all of that. But it has to do a little bit with what I was saying before in this context of critical theory, right? We ultimately gave you the concept of critique. We gave you critical theory. We gave you critical thinking. You see, so it is a pattern. And so again, the framework is important to detect these slippages and these problems, right? And I was wondering when you were discussing fleshing out the concept of God is not man, and you pointed out that, of course, the idea of God is not gender, it's another term. I was wondering if, and this is really an honest question, is that a monotheist idea of God? What God is exactly? Is that already Christianized version of God? Because I wonder also what other forms of thinking might be there that may be less transparent to a Christian theological framework, right? That are also in the and that might enrich the process of opposing this monopoly of giving, right? With Professor Hernandez, I feel very close to the proposal, and I think that I wanted to mention when you brought up the concept of pedagogy of love, that in the context of Chicana feminism, and you might know this already, but someone like Sheila Sandoval put very at the center of her work the category of what she called decolonial love, right? Decolonial love. It's something I've been in conversation with that for about 20 years, still find it extremely important. More recently, Julia Butella wrote a book about revolutionary love, for example. So I think some of us continue thinking that, for me, it has been very useful to think about also reading Fanon, even, sorry?
Bell
Hooks has all the works on love, right? All about love and so on and so forth. For me, it has been very important, a clue to read Fanon. Fanon also wrote about love. Today I believe in the possibility of love, right? Love is a kind of a core element there. And I think love, as I mentioned yesterday, is one of the elements in Fanon's work that I think avoid a slippage into Afro-pessimism, right? So you were talking about the pedagogy of terror and the pedagogy of love. I think for me it has been that opposing, I don't think it would be a pedagogy of terror. I mean, what I've been trying to think, right, is this pedagogy of the, right, and this with Afro-pessimism has been very clear denouncing this, is this liberal pedagogy that at the end tells you that, and this links with what we said before, that everything is already within, the answers are found within liberalism, always, right? That is what Afro-pessimism says, no, right? No. But then by saying no, it's like then there doesn't seem to be possibilities of changing anything at all. And that's where love is the upsurge of the impossible, right? In the context of facing what seems to be your decimation, somehow, love seems to describe an upsurge of givenness and affirmation of life that will come out and become present even in the midst of the most terrible circumstances, right? And I think it's out of that love then that generates the form of writing and activities and thinking and theologies that then you were describing to us. So similarly, that love could perhaps be as that root, and that these theologies and forms of writing that you were describing could be seen as an emanation of your pedagogy of love. And maybe these are things that you can, you are thinking about these, maybe you could comment about that linkage there between these things. And finally, what you were describing there as like these forms of writing, when my presentation, I'll be talking about combative decoloniality. And this is rooted in Fanon's distinction between, or description of what he called combative writing, as opposed to intellectual work, even theological, philosophical, right, of the one that you find in the academy, typically that is non-combative or counter-combative, even when addressing topics of liberation, decolonization, and all of that. And Fanon said that one of the fundamental marks of combative writing is not so much when elite professional intellectuals write another book about this or that, but when people who are in prison, who are facing the death penalty, who are in very precarious situations due to their position in society and the system, and because they struggle against colonialism, when they, who had no previous desire or idea or plan to write, are prone to do it. Take the pen, take the keyboard, and then see themselves as some people who have to say something, to share it, to put it together. And that's the birth of combative writing, and through that combative philosophizing and combative theologizing, which in your words is also incarnated. So I think that there will be some more conversation between what I'll be presenting and that, but I wanted to put that I think is important, both the framework to avoid the ambiguities I was talking about. The framework is key, but also combativity is key, this activity on the ground, because many of these things cannot be really fleshed out within the liberal spaces of the university and the academy. They need to be, your body needs to be somewhere else too. That's it.
So now we'll just open the floor for just general comments. If you have anything you'd like to say, the preference for the panelists first, and then I have microphone and I'll just come pass it to you so we can I'll be live stream. So yeah, the panelists.
Well, first I want to say that now that I'm reading a lot about the concept of love, we have from philosophy, theology. I was very amused that when Harvey wrote Multitude about the concept of love and became so popular, that feminism has been writing about love for so long, and why certain voices are love as a political concept is central in feminism. So it's not only Chavez, it's not Gloria Anzaldúa's work. I mean, it has been, so I really talking about decolonizing. What are the values that we quote and who inspire us? So in that sense, I think that something interesting, important for me is to consider the writing, and also in my teaching practices as another ways of theorization. So not just to use those books so my students can analyze as texts, as testimonies, but those texts are theory about the world. They are theorizing about it. So I think that also a way to diversify our syllabus or teaching are considering this combative writing and the concept as a theorization about the world. And I didn't have time to develop this idea of how are they teaching this law? I mean, I talk about the peace talks in schools and different places there, the writing, but it's incarnated because they are also, when they put their body in the manuscripts, when they are there, when they sacralize those spaces, they are also giving love to unknown people. And an anecdote that I tell that for me was very impressive, I'm going to try to summarize very quickly, is that in Sinaloa, this poor woman that had very precarious works buy a piece of land in the cemetery. So the people that were in the common mass graves, back of the state, that have not been recognized, can be adopted by them. So each of them can adopt an unrecognized person, and instead of being in common mass grave, can have a tomb in which this woman will go and pray and put flowers. And so this is a different kind of love that is not the mothering family traditional love that the feminists have criticized. It's a totally different conceptions of community, of family, and love. So to buy a piece of land is they need the money to survive, and they are doing this for an unknown dead person. So just to give an example.
The only person that is included that comes to mind that speaks of something of a community of the vanquished or a community of the dead and takes that very seriously that I know is Metz. Metz has a whole imagination that includes the dead as a community that is. See? So he might be somebody you want to check out.
You know what I would like to do? I'd like to put Metz, Johann Baptist Metz, in conversation with African theology of the ancestors, because that's one of the distinguishing features of African theology. The dead are always with us. There is no justice without them. There is no peace without them. I think that would be an interesting conversation. I did want to affirm what you said about how the people in Algeria did not need the French to teach them about critique. So this is just sorry. The Winston Churchill came to Kenya in I forget now, maybe 1907. I think he came in 1907, and then your president. What's wrong with it? But there were two big dignitaries who came to Kenya, in particular to travel this colonial way. And Winston Churchill declared they made a special seat for him at the front of the locomotive. They put a bench there, so he was actually riding outside. And Kenya, we've got this wonderful national parks, and you can see the big five and stuff. So they wanted to come in hunt. So he was actually riding on that bench outside and seeing all the views. And one of the amazing things about Kenyan geography is that if the rail comes from the coast all the way to the border with Uganda, is that the topography really changes. So you come from the coast, and then you're in the savannah, and then you're in the highlands, and then you're in the valley. It's beautiful. It's crazy beautiful. So he's riding in that thing, and he declared, he's like, this railway, and he wrote it in his book called My African Journey. He said, this railway is the most wonderful and most romantic railway in the world. That's what he's saying. Meanwhile, there was a prophet among my people called Mumu who saw it and said, this is an iron sea. And that's how it's known by people. And they taught us critique. They didn't. We knew. And he knew it was an iron stick because it had already begun to be with them to the Africans. That's how let's just talk about that. And what you said about what other non-Christian voices might be in there, oh my goodness, they are so there. Especially because we are calling on language before Christianity. And I haven't yet done that work, but I want to do that work of mining, that just how much that one statement is carrying also as a way, not just to decolonize the narrative of colonialism, but to decolonize Christianity and the ideas of God. Wow.
I want to add in reference to the gathering of the dead and the ancestors. You had mentioned. You mentioned the people trained at the School of Americas in Georgia going on to commit massacres, and many of you probably already know about the School of Americas Watch, the movement that names Presente. So it's in one place in which that theology from that has emerged. How do I say? There's some resonance there, and I can point you to some books on the School of Americas Watch if anybody's interested in following that particular movement. In terms of what you mentioned, Nelson, about terms being ambiguous, I'll just say that there's been a lot of worry or maybe just regrets and loss, I think, about the ways in which conspiracy movements, for example, in a particular acute way in the United States right now, use the language of critique to do very, very radically destructive things. And I personally felt the ambiguity of terms, as you mentioned, whenever Trump was elected, because so much of the appeal to the people, the rhetoric of populism obviously is fundamentally ambivalent and is used in a lot of ways. And I was trained in peace studies, in which popular movements are the base for everything, right? And not our curriculums do not spend enough time thinking about the popular movements of the right? And if you're not thinking about both, you're not preparing for the future, right? You're not creating an innocent future. Those are just my thoughts on your question.
I just want to thank all of you. I think this has been such a rich, rich conversation. I want to lift up in particular a couple of things with what Netta was saying about the dead, and of course in Carlos's work as well, the reexistence, the resurrection, the remembering, and the dead speak, you know. And I think part of where I'm going with this and where I want to call attention to it is the subversion of evil that happens through the sacralization of these mass graves and the recovery of the bones and the bodies of those that have died. And even, Aída, what you were saying, those women who are working to do that even once they've already found their own children, but for others who they don't know. And I think that's a really important point to lift forward as you did, precisely because it's an affirmation of a social and a connectivity that has gotten lost in many ways, especially in this country, because of a hyper individualism that moves to such an extreme that it's all about me and mine. And that's a critique of that in such a profound way that I think it has massive significance, and it's very important. So I just wanted to lift that up. And it's a subversion of the evil that's there. And it connects into the relationality that a lot of decolonial thought advances. So I think that's very important. So thank you.
This just points to some of the work that we'll be doing this winter. But one of the things that I noticed in this talk in particular is that the reference to Afro-pessimism and their no regarding the insufficiency of liberalism has a very similar shape to Barth's no to the Reichsbürger in the Second World War and Nazi fascism. And I think it's also a very similar shape to some versions of the queer futurity, which is to say, we will just say no to this. There is no future. And then the question then becomes, of course, how do you handle hope? And the name I would invoke into the space from the book on the pedagogy of love is Antonia Darder, who's one of the various students. And one of the things that she says kind of in one of her few technical passages in that book, she said, my response to the need to say no to the pedagogies of oppression is to tell you the stories of places where it is not one. And so the whole back half of the book is just vignettes, no theory. And I think there's a necessary move in that regard, theologically, pedagogically, anthropologically, to say our response to this is not with argument, but with evidence. And let the argument be the lives of the people who are trying to find something.
Thank you. For the session about to come to an end. Professor, you have any final word you'd like to say in reaction to this?
No, it's only, I think, bringing that I think what I heard from the presentation is that the testimonies are also theoretical, right? That the testimonies are also, so it is the evidence, but the evidence already is presenting another way of theorizing and therefore another way of looking at the world and coming together. And that is also, cannot be disconnected from the bodies that do all of this together. So there is between embodiment, theory, narrative, praxis, all of them are tied. And I think that connects with combative decoloniality, what I've been thinking about, which I'm going to talk next. So that could be a good segue.
If you add another insight that really helpful with your talks, because we're trying to get together kind of knowledge about political theology. And why I keep in my mind, my heart today is that what kind of bodies and what kind of narratives are we listening? We really need to take care of and accompany them. That's absolutely important. It's not any kind of bodies, but those bodies that don't matter in hegemonic societies that are the source of knowledge. I would like to keep that in mind, and my heart also trying to connect with other traditions. A big challenge is how to decolonize Christianity, which has been a hegemonic narrative. So probably this kind of knowledge coming from the subaltern, the victim, the survivors is the source of knowledge, and then how can we also through rituals and spirituality improve a kind of interconnection between different traditions. So thank you so much for watching. Yeah. So the next session will start half an hour, so.
Yeah.